All right. I am delighted to be here and happy to talk to you today about this title, which I'm quite proud of. Sights and Sights, Vision and Place in American Travel Writing. I want to thank Julian Gärtner and Marius Littschwager for organizing this valuable conference and developing its very useful focus on acts of comparing. In this talk today, I embraced both acts of comparing and ambiguity and multiplicity, beginning with the ambiguity and multiplicity of meaning in the phrase American travel writing, which means travel writing by Americans and travel writing about Americans or in the Americas. And I plan to refer to both of them. Many of my examples come from 19th century American travel books about Europe, because that is the field I know well. There are 4 people in the country, at least 4 who know as much as I do, but I don't think that many more. So as I talk today, I'm going to cover a wide range of topics and texts. At times, I'm going to mention texts that I believe some of you will be interested to know about, and I'll have at least a couple that I'm confident that none of you have heard about, and I hope we'll be interested in that. My goal today is to extend these arguments about American travel writing in Europe to a larger consideration of travel writing. And I will tell you that when I was a very naive young grad student, I embraced the topic of American travel writing because C.U. Holman, the smartest man I ever met, told me it was a great topic and needed to work on. And I discovered I didn't have the tools I needed. I didn't have the rhetoric of travel writing or a theory of travel writing that really worked for me. Louise Pratt was just doing her work. There were some other people who've mentioned travel, but it's still something that I feel today. And the talk today is an initial step on a journey that I welcome you to complete and take to arrive at a more comprehensive theory of travel writing, or more precisely, a rhetoric of travel writing. Any rhetoric of travel writing must acknowledge the role of the traveler, the idea of the journey, and the ways that meanings are created or conveyed in the act of writing. In literary terms, the traveler is both protagonist and narrator. The journey provides the plot or structure of the narrative. The sites travel through form the setting, and the language used to envision various landscapes, urban vistas, or contact zones. This language does what scholars of science fiction called world building, one of the most useful literary terms I've ever had, world building. And this language also has the potential to enlarge the narrated experience of a single traveler into a multi-layered panorama of significance. The problem with the structure I've been outlining is that it omits the role of the reader in the creation of meaning, or more precisely, a consideration of the different types of roles that readers play in different times and places and for different texts. Perhaps the best place to begin an attempt to outline a rhetoric of travel writing is to compare the different kinds of audiences that books about travel seem to envision. And for simplicity's sake, I will engage what I've been taught to call a false binary. I will engage in some broad strokes to outline various structures in that. And I want to suggest that we can divide readers into 3 broad categories: the non-traveler, the future traveler, and the past traveler. The non-traveler is reading a book about a place he or she will almost certainly never see, never go to. The travel account provides a kind of vicarious experience of foreign lands or unknown places or exotic sites, and if successful, paints a picture of fascinating landscapes and encounters with the strange, the unusual, the other, with forms of difference. That reader may learn to appreciate these strange new worlds or to fear and reject them. Although we might like to think of travel as enlarging the human spirit, the travel book is equally capable of reinforcing provincialism and xenophobia, of reassuring readers that there is really no need to leave the security of home and suffer the indignities of travel in order to appreciate the superiority of one's own homeland or understand the inferiority of other peoples, customs, and values. The cultural work performed by much of the travel writing in the 19th century works in exactly this way, and I am talking both about books written by Americans about foreign lands, especially Europe, and about books written about the Americas by visitors from other nations, especially the British. The central values that I'm talking about, reading travel books in order to affirm one's sense of home, is the dominant discourse of the 19th century, and it is presented with particular clarity in the most important book on the subject of travel writing that you have never heard of, Cyrus Augustus Barthol's Pictures of Europe Framed in Ideas, an 1855 tract on travel by a minor transcendentalist. And what Barthold did that's somewhat unusual is he said, I'm going to write about Europe, but I'm a transcendentalist, so my sense of time is different, and my sense of place is different, and the only thing that matters are meaning. So he has an essay telling you, what do you learn from travel? He has an essay on how to look at nature. He has one on how to look on mountains. He has one on how to look at rivers. He has one how to look at history. He has one how to look at scenes of religion. And he explicates these things with remarkable clarity, and it's just a lovely introduction to 19th century symbolism. Framed in Ideas is very clear that there's a central 19th century notion, which I believe to be Anglo-American. It may spread elsewhere, and it goes this way. The greatest purpose of travel is to endow the traveler with a greater appreciation of his own home and country. This can be nationalistic, it can be bigoted, or it can simply be, I've loved Germany, but I love the US too, and my time abroad teaches me how much I love America. There's a wonderful phenomena in American literature of Americans who go abroad to discover an American voice. My favorite example is Robert Frost, who goes to Europe, works as a secretary for Ezra Pound, and while there, discovers his New England voice and does those first few charming books, which he gets from the experience of European travel. That's the positive point about this. There's a darker side, which I've already suggested. I would like to believe that books make people think, that books open mind. But a review of many of the most popular travel books of the 19th century, or of the nonfiction bestseller list of the New York Times for our last 20 years, suggests that books can often endow a closed mind with the smug pleasure of easy complacency. I like that phrase, I'll repeat it. The smug pleasure of easy complacency. If you want to get that, mostly it's the books that you don't know and don't need to know, probably. The immensely popular travel books of Joel Tyler Headley and Daniel Clark Eddy, massive bestsellers in the 19th century, and explained to an antebellum United States vividly the moral, social, political horrors and corruptions of various parts of Europe, particularly parts of Europe that experience Catholicism and forms of aristocracy. The non-traveling reader of travel books may learn about wonders and blessings of other lands, but is likely to desire and receive confirmation of his own prejudice as he is to discover the common humanity he shares with peoples of other lands. In a historical framework, travel writing after the 1860s in America tends to be more cosmopolitan. Travel writing before 1850s was deeply but only partially responsible for the bigotry of the know-nothing movement in America and other forms of American prejudice. I've mentioned the non-traveler reader. There's, of course, the future traveler who is seeking advice and guidance. He's really seeking a guidebook, a form of travel writing that really doesn't exist before the 19th century and really becomes popular in the middle and late 19th century as technology made travel easier and more affordable. These readers want books that will tell them what they must see, and perhaps even more importantly, warn them about potential dangers and discomforts, teaching them what they should avoid, what they should not experience, what they need not or should not see. In short, these guidebooks are both prescriptive and proscriptive. The reader who aspires to travel through the worlds described in these books seems open to new experiences, but guidebooks can actually limit the kinds of things that travelers will discover or see. They can easily turn travelers into mere tourists going through a land, ticking off the boxes on a page. This is actually a picture you find in many travel books. And many 19th century travel writers frequently seize on the distinction between the real traveler and the mere tourist, criticizing the commercialization of travel into a form that led the traveler into various sites without producing any insights. The great subject of ridicule is the traveler with a Baedeker, literally checking off and ticking off sites along the way. And that brings me to a reflection on the contrast between the number of sites covered and the depth of insight experienced. And I will give you my extreme example, my binary. The most popular travel writer of mid-19th century America was almost certainly Bayard Taylor, also a minor poet, who dared to go to Europe with very little money, but a brave willingness to tramp, to walk, to go hiking and camping. His immensely popular Views Afoot in 1846 went to numerous editions, and he is the person who invented young people hiking their ways through Europe. He invented this form of travel. He wrote many, many travel books. Unfortunately, with the notable exception on his book on California, El Dorado in 1850, these books are incredibly superficial. One critic has noted with sad accuracy that Bayard Taylor has traveled further and seen less than any man living. I wish that weren't true, but I think it is. In contrast, Thoreau's Walden is, among many other things, a parody of the travel book and a reinvention of the form and the genre. Of course, Thoreau tells you he's begun by traveling widely in Concord. And we should all travel widely in Concord, even while waiting for the train. The section in the chapter Economy, detailing how little money one needs to survive on in a year in Walden, is partially an explicit parody of Taylor's financial guidance, telling you how little money you need to spend a year in Europe. It's a parody of a dozen other things, too. But the crucial point is Thoreau's insight that the real adventures of life must be measured in the depth of one's insight and experience, and not the number of sights that one has passed on the road without really seeing. As a travel guidebook, Thoreau is ultimately more valuable to a thinking traveler than Taylor is. At some point in the 19th century, the travel book gained a new audience. The reader who turned to travel writing to revisit scenes he or she had actually visited. These books enabled readers to relive cherished experiences or to move to a larger and fuller understanding of other places and times. These books tend to be less critical and more cosmopolitan in their depiction of foreign scenes. The traveler is more than a mere observer of difference, often becoming a fuller participant in the lives of others and generally portraying the specific qualities of language, dress, gesture, custom, in vivid details that both mark points of contrast and distinction and affirm an underlying common humanity that unites reader, traveler, and foreigner. These more cosmopolitan travel books have received less attention than anything else in that, particularly the more satirical and critical portraits of other lands and people. The example I want to cite is of the major American writer of his own time, who's now slipping out of the canon as we speak. That's William Dean Howells, regarded most of his life as the greatest American author, and he'll still be on somebody's dissertation reading list, but not that many people. He was also one of the great travel writers of his time, and there's no more vivid or humane picture of Italy, and I'm including James in this, than that offered by Howells in Venetian Life, 1866, and Italian Journeys. These are the books that launched his literary career. These are the books that won the esteem of the Boston intelligentsia. These are the books that got him teaching modern languages at Harvard, got him an honorary MA at Harvard, not a bad thing to have, and ultimately got him the editorship of the Atlantic Monthly. They remained in print in expanded and revised forms through the early 20th century. And his warm and detailed portraits of his own interaction with Italy and its people deserve much more attention, as is this kind of cosmopolitan travel writing I'm talking about. Incidentally, Howells really met Mark Twain because he reviewed Innocents Abroad, and was the first person to review that sensibly. People don't know this. Howells was the first critic to positively recognize the genius of Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost, the first to give them rave reviews and to say, here are new distinctive voices. And I like the fact that our greatest critic of realism understands the achievement of our two great poets of realism, Frost and Dickinson. The reader of travel writing is exposed usually to two primary subjects: the places described and the traveler who serves as narrator and sometimes protagonist. Our rhetoric of travel writing must appreciate the various ways in which the traveler may be presented. When I first approached American travel writing in my dissertation, I wrongly presumed that travel writing would be largely an apprenticeship form, allowing a young aspiring writer to master the craft of fiction, and that the structure would focus on what the traveler learns, perhaps even demonstrating a movement from innocence to knowledge. I was mostly wrong. This is occasionally true. There are works of initiation, such as Melville's Typee. There are works in which the traveler portrays himself as a young adventurer exploring new worlds, and there are many, many more works in which the traveler portrays himself as a gentleman and sage who demonstrates his wisdom with shrewd observations and genial sense of humor. Travel writing was almost, but not quite as important as journalism in providing American writers with some American writers with valuable apprenticeships. Travel writing helped Howells master the arts of narrative and storytelling in ways conducive to the values of realism. It provided a fluid structure for the aspiring novelist, teaching him the importance of the self-contained episode, vivid characterization, and fidelity to the meaningful detail that can illuminate the realities of everyday life. And these are the three critical points of travel writing: self-contained episode, vivid characterization, fidelity to meaningful detail that illuminates the world. It was important to James and Twain in different ways. All of these writers produced travel books throughout their career. There are other writers in America, major ones, who did not work in the form of travel writing until the ends of their career, until they were well established, most notably Hawthorne and Emerson. Hawthorne's very seriously underrated masterpiece about England, Our Old Home, was his final book, and written to make use of the material he was unable to transform into a novel, and also, as Nina Boehm has shown in her exceptional work, his way of redefining himself in the last years of his life as a Victorian sage who could speak wisdom to people about their own country and another country, and also recapture his mastery of the genial essay. The persona Hawthorne assumes in that book is not that of the American innocent, but of the Victorian sage, a man beyond the period of youthful initiation, a man more likely to teach than to learn, a man who approaches his life abroad with maturity and judgment. This persona of traveling sage is what we find in almost all the late travel books of authors who produced multiple works of travel over long careers, including James and Howells. Arguably, however, the most influential American book of the early 19th century is Washington Irving's Sketchbook, in which the author adopts the persona of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman. Irving's choice of persona reflects an almost desperate need to prove to the world that Americans could be gentlemen, could be sophisticated appreciators of the emblems of history and culture, could provide the appropriate genteel and sentimental responses to European ruins and monuments, understanding them, not as representations of the greatness of European culture, but understanding them as emblems of the mutability of all things. There is a cultural anxiety that shapes American travel writing throughout the antebellum period and is reflected in the development of a narrator who demonstrates his capacity to respond to the cultural richness of the European past while maintaining a calm faith in the future glories of American democracy. The late 18th century fascination with mutability and sentiment was of immense use to Irving and others, enabling to show that they were genteel enough to appreciate European scenes and shrewd enough to understand the limitations implicit in any civilization whose achievements were in the past. Mark Twain will ultimately take this a giant step further, dispensing with the emphasis on American gentility while maintaining an insistence on seeing much of Europe as a pile of ruins whose best days are in the past. We are more likely to value the shrewd and sardonic wit of Twain's Innocent Abroad over the carefully polished prose of Irving's American Gentleman, but Irving shaped the travel writing of the early America. It's an influence clear in 3 books, 2 of which you really shouldn't read, but they were important. One is Donald Grant Mitchell's Fresh Gleanings, which established the persona Ick Marvel, who has been justly forgotten from our literary history. But Mitchell helped establish the incredible wave of sentimentalization that marks American discourse in the 1850s, which Anne Douglas wrongly ascribes to women writers in the feminization of American culture. It was a bunch of guys who did this sentimental stuff. The women writers of American literature have always been tougher, shrewder, and meaner than the male writers. The other one is worth reading. It's Henry Tuckermans' Italian Sketchbook, which is a very appreciative portrait of Europe, of Italy, 1835, expanded to 1848, mostly with the addition of anti-Catholic sentiment, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Outremer, 1835, a work that is important because of its fundamental failures. Longfellow went on a 2-year tour of Europe, sent there by Harvard so he could be a master of modern languages and teach it. And while abroad, Longfellow wrote the most charming, vivid, humorous letters. They've been printed. They were a delight to read. When it came time to launch his literary career with the travel book, He ignored all of that material, all that good, wonderful material, and produced third-rate Irving, a sad combination of sentimental reflection and dull prose. My point is that the genres and expectations that define travel writing make it impossible for some writers to see the world they're pretending to describe, and that genre can obscure vision, especially when we try to deal with place. Nevertheless, Irving also established the American travel book as a combination of generic forms, a series of genial essays with various modes, punctuated with short stories, some of which have almost nothing to do with the scenes described in the essays, claiming to be nonfiction and factual. Thus, the most enduring parts of the sketchbook are the two American tales, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which serve as an ironically vivid contrast to the quiet domesticity of English rural life that Irving claims to admire. In this sense, Geoffrey Crayon seems to be more a genial collector of other people's tales than a storyteller with a commitment to a master narrative or controlling ideas. Yet understanding travel writing requires us to delineate the relationship of the form to fiction and other genres. In early America, the views of what you would see in Europe were so much a part of the expectations of a naturalist culture that two fairly significant, though now for underrated writers, Royal Tyler and James Kirk Paulding, both wrote travel books about England without going there. They didn't need to. They knew what they were going to say, and they wrote other texts. Now, this partly reflects a kind of nationalistic bias, because if you are a real nationalist, I hear nationalism's coming back, you don't need to listen to other people to look or see. You simply look in your gut and you know what the world is. I won't make the political connection. No. What I will tell you is this also reflects the awareness of the skilled writer that travel writing is a series of conventions and can be mastered appropriately. Later in the 19th century, Mark Twain actually hired someone to do the traveling for him. And he hired someone he was going to send around the world, who would send back these reports and details and places, and he would make it funny and fix it up. He was really excited. The poor guy died en route before he could send them anything. It's kind of sad. But there is a very good writer who Twain admired named Marietta Holley, who published the Samantha books by Josiah Allen's wife. And she's one of the 2 or 3 major female humorists of the late 19th century. And she wrote a lot of very good travel books about the World's Fairs and other places without ever leaving home, because she simply gathered the material, she had her persona, she had her characters, and these were all bestsellers there. The travel book claims to be nonfiction, but we rarely discuss it in terms of autobiography, a genre which, as you know, can be more fictional, often involves a controlling imagination, and there are many, many stories of autobiographies which turn out to be fake, including one about, it was 20 years ago, about someone who wrote his life as a Holocaust survivor, and he wasn't. But there are dozens of other cases, and one seems to come out every 4 or 5 years. The relationship of travel writing to autobiography, to fiction, and that is crucial, particularly in terms of the nature of the traveler. It used to be fashionable to talk about the highest level of fiction, of literary creation, not as expressing the self, but of moving beyond the self, of overcoming egoism, and finding a form that will free the writer from excessive emotional involvement. What interests me and what I've been outlining is a persona of American travel writing that isn't really based on an author's life in some cases, and may actually be a kind of central contradiction that. One of the basic facts behind the genre of Americans in Europe is that Americans frequently went to Europe for their health, There's a particular pattern in New England where New England clergymen or scholars would suffer from overwork and personal crisis and death and grief and loss. And if they had the money, they used it, and if they didn't, their parish would raise the money, and you'd send the clergyman abroad for his health. This is a fact never mentioned in the travel books produced by these people, because no good American is going to say that Europe is healthier than New York City. Sorry. And nor will they use the idea themselves that European travel can be healthier in some ways, and that the journey can lead to renewed health and vigor. In fact, what they do suggest, to some extent, is that European travel poses a health risk to the new republic by infecting good Americans with aristocratic pretensions and affectations. Now, in defense of America, we got that from the British, and if you've read your 18th century literature, there's always in British literature the character called the fop, who's the Englishman who spent too much time in France and he's come back ruined. And what Americans do is they take the English fop and turn him into an American fop along the way. There are contradictions at the core of the genre, and there's a central one at the heart of American travel writing in the early and mid-19th century. Almost every American writer in this period wrote at least one travel book about travel abroad. And almost every single one of them made a statement condemning foreign travel. The most famous example of this is probably Emerson, who proclaimed traveling to be a fool's paradise in self-reliance. The soul is no traveler. And then spent more time trying to write English traits than any book he ever wrote and finished. He struggled with it. It was agony. It was painful, because he's struggling with some of the contradictions that affected smart Americans. So here's the quick gun and camera approach to American travel writing. There are Americans who go through Europe superficially saying everything's beautiful. There are more Americans who create more detail of everything, saying everything's awful and inferior and vicious and terrible. And then there are the smart American writers who want to appreciate culture but affirm American identity. And you get a complex struggle in which the cultural anxieties have to be transformed into some way of reconciling these contradictions. And I've noted some. But the major example of the travel writer, Washington Irving established his career by transforming the travel narrative into an influential literary form. He spent much of his life abroad, continued to do travel books. His Alhambra is one of the great travel books. It's hardly read at all. In his 1835 Tour of the Prairie, Irving warned against European travel because it would make young Americans luxurious and effeminate, and asserted that travel into the American landscape would produce, quote, the manliness, simplicity, and self-dependence most in unison with our political institutions. The gender dynamics of the statement are intriguing, if simplistic, in their manifestation of the false binary of effeminate Europe and manly America. So let's just move on to a statement. Underlying the structure of the travel book is the contact between traveler and place, between the traveler's commitment to his own homeland and the values represented by the places visited. Although I've been focusing on a specific type of travel writing in which Americans had to cope with their cultural anxieties by reconciling their appreciation of European cultural, artistic, and historical achievements with their own defensiveness, there are a need to assert the value of a homeland whose cultural achievements were thus far only promises and dreams. I wanted to make a more general claim about travel writing. I want to suggest that the traveler in the best travel writing almost always constitute a representative self who embodies a specific set of values. The values can change, but the idea of the representative self seems to be there. And I want to suggest that travel writing usually requires the creation of both a literary persona designed to represent specific values and a set of narrative strategies that enables this persona to cope with, confront, or affirm or reject the values represented by the places to which he travels. In simpler terms, we can view the travel writer as placed on a spectrum ranging from pilgrim to missionary. The pilgrim starts on his journey as an empty vessel and hopes to find fulfillment, to be filled by the sacred places he visits. In contrast, the missionary is filled with sacred knowledge, and the landscape he enters are empty and in need of fulfillment he offers. And to shift the metaphor a bit, if we think of travel as a university, then the traveler may assume the persona of either teacher or student along that way. And at this point, I need to note that travel books do not always require a fully developed portrait of the traveler narrator, that many, in fact, forego mentioning the personal details of a traveler's life in favor of a focus on places seen and described and explained. There are awfully a lot of dull books out there that go from place to place, offering only description and moralizing commentary. There are also insightful books of social and political analysis, perhaps most notably de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, that do not rely primarily on elaborate presentations of personal experience. Yet many travel books do present the experience of travel in a highly dramatic form, as well as precisely rendered pictures of various places. And a brief note for a book again that you probably don't know, but the person who is probably the best travel writer in 19th century America in terms of dealing with Europe. He also has a book on Hawaii that's also just okay. And that is James Jackson Jarvis, who was a nationalist figure who did a series of essays about Paris and France with the symbolic title of Parisian Sights and French Principles Seen Through American Spectacles, 1852 and 55. Amazing, dramatic, powerful ones. In the second one, he captures the transformation of Paris in the late 1840s and 50s and that. He went on to write a bigger, fuller book that may be the single best travel book from the point of view of perspective. You've got to get beyond the prejudice and that, but in terms of dramatic incidents, and that is Italian Sights and Papal Principles Seen Through American Spectacles. I love that title. It's 1856. Jarvis is against aristocracy. He's suspicious of Catholicism, but his writing is lively, vivid, detailed, informative. He has a sense of dramatic incidents. He understands the tragedies in daily life as well as the comedy. And after taking nationalistic writing to a height, he ended up spending the rest of his life in Italy, was instrumental in transforming our understanding of Italian art, especially pre-Raphaelite American art. And Jarvis in 1883 actually wrote another travel book, not nearly as interesting and powerful, repudiating every value judgment he made in the early texts and asserting that Americans had a lot to learn from Italy, where he himself had chosen to live, and became a Catholic. It's an informative life. It's not something you're likely to find. Again, Jarvis and American Spectacles. Our rhetoric of travel writing needs to cope with the meanings inherent in the idea of place, which in the context of travel must include the places we start from, the places we go to, and the sites we pass along the way. Place is to travel, writing, a setting is to novel. It is the physical locus of meaning. As Disserteau reminds us, every story is a travel story, a spatial practice. In the context of American writing, it may be useful to note that the meaning of place is particularly important to realism's fascination with the act of travel and its development of the international novel, which usually focuses on Americans traveling in Europe, but sometimes depicts foreign visitors in the United States. The form invites the clashing of values, frequently between exemplars of American innocence and European experience, and sometimes between democratic ideals and aristocratic ambitions. In this respect, American realism's exploration of social hierarchies often leads to significant questions about the role of social class in a culture purportedly devoted to ideals of Republican equality. Both Henry James and Mark Twain build major fictions on traveling innocents who are simultaneously naive and resourceful as they move through landscapes marked by arbitrary social conventions and class boundaries. The traveler's intrusions into new sites and social situations set up dramatic confrontations that reveal the underlying moral positions that define both the traveler and the places visited. In this respect, geography defines character. In this respect, geography can be morality. The sense of place in realism is fraught with political, social, and moral implications. Characters are ultimately judged by their ability to maintain a sense of personal integrity in spite of the temptations embedded in specific sites, or by their ability to triumph over the prejudices that dominate specific social settings. Although travel often provides the basic plot structure of novels, in most of the major novels of American realism that rely on travel, sharp observation, precise description, and skillfully rendered dialogue provide the foundation for narratives. This is a very important claim, and I hope I'm right about it. Sometimes I am. These provide the foundation for narratives in which characterization and setting are almost always more important than plot in that. The ways in which place contains meanings merits considerations. Let's begin by noting that the meaning that a place has may involve cultural associations that do not require personal experience with or travel in that space. For instance, when Shakespeare wanted to write about passionate love, he almost always wrote about Italy and Italians. Now, he had a remarkable imagination, but he could not imagine a passionate love story set in England. He just couldn't in that. Italy provides a setting for both his romantic comedies and his most passionate tragedies, and he has a very rich sense of place. So in the great play Hamlet, there are two university students who are major characters. One is Hamlet, who goes to school in Wittenberg, the site of the Protestant Reformation. That's probably the best place to send the kid to school if he wants to be a moralizing philosopher and be deeply concerned that. In contrast, the other university student is Laertes, who goes to the University of Paris, which I imagine as the ultimate party school in the ultimate party town. And that. I don't know if you have this in Germany or in Europe, but in the United States, we have light bulb jokes about various universities. There's some for the Ivies and the Northeastern schools. The ones I like in particular are the California University light bulb jokes, and it goes like this. How many Berkeley students does it take to screw in a light bulb? The answer is 101. 1 to do it, 50 to do the demonstration against them, and 50 to do the counter demonstration. How many UCLA students does it take to screw in a light bulb? 1, but the whole world revolves around him. How many UC Santa Barbara students does it take to screw in a light bulb? 1, but he gets 6 credits for doing it. How many UC Irvine students does it take to screw in a light bulb? Irvine looks better in the dark. And there is a kind of specificity in place and a meaning in place that's central, and that predates this. Geography is, I've said, can be morality. It can be a set of values, certainly identity. People who do not know the American South tend to think of it as one homogeneous region defined by conservative values and a peculiar racial history. But those who know it understand that there are different Southern communities. In Charleston, they will ask you who your grandparents were. In Macon, they will ask you what church you go to. In Atlanta, they will ask you what you do for a living. And in Savannah, they will ask you what you want to drink. And the sense of different values associated with the jokes of place and community are part of the complexity of place and the way in which place has meaning before travel. The 19th century had a very specific theory about how places assume meaning. It's usually referred to as the theory of association. The classic text on it is Henry Tuckermans' Month in England, which is nothing but literary sites and that. And it goes like this: places are inherently devoid of meaning. Even waterfalls, even landscapes, that. What gives meaning to places? Literature and history. I like this because it makes authors important. And part of what James Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving were deliberately doing for New York State was endowing that landscape with meaning. And Irving is responsible for the Rip Van Winkle motels you can still find in the Catskills. And Cather was trying to bring the muse to Nebraska. And literature gives meaning. Now, in this theory, a natural landscape might be lovely, but its final meaning for travelers depends largely on some association with battle or event or famous person. And you know this because one of the things is the river cruise up the Rhine is quite lovely. It's my favorite part of German travel. It gains in significance if the viewer knows at least some of the stories associated with some of the castles you pass along the way. And you can at least know enough to understand why at a certain part people will start singing Die Lorelei very loudly at times. There is actually a literature-inspired tourism that comes at various moments. The last and most status of these cases was probably Dan Brown's 2003 bestseller, The Da Vinci Code, a lively thriller with a preposterous sense of history and theology that drew tourists to see the Louvre, Westminster Abbey, and other sites, all for the wrong reasons. There were once many commercial tours, and you can still find walking tours where you can retrace the steps of the Da Vinci Code, just in case you need a reason to go to Paris, which no one does. There are enough reasons there. The German equivalent may be the tourists who go to the American Southwest in hope of visualizing the landscapes written over by Old Shatterhand and the characters in Karl May's fiction. For me, one of the most interesting underexplored forms of travel is a literary pilgrimage. Stratford-on-Avon is a particularly pretty town, but the reason to go there is to see the birthplace of Shakespeare. It's one of the obligatory stops for Americans traveling in England. I have gained a greater sense of some writers by visiting their birthplaces and homeland, specifically of Thomas Wolfe in Asheville, North Carolina, and Flannery O'Connor in Savannah, Georgia, where I really felt sorry for their childhoods after seeing their homes and got an understanding of what they're responding to. For American travel writers in particular, the literary pilgrimage often turns into an intriguing form of veiled autobiography. So you go to Stratford. We know nothing about Shakespeare's life. There are lots of stories. and you get to imagine Shakespeare. And how do you imagine Shakespeare? Well, the most obvious example is Harriet Beecher Stowe, underrated travel book, Sunny Memories of Foreign Lands. Very smart book. She goes there and she says, I wonder how Shakespeare would have attacked slavery. And then she wonders if Shakespeare actually had a stepmother he hated. She did. And there's a complete reimagining of the self in these terms. Irving had done the same thing in his sketches. Other writers do it. Beyond the veiled autobiography, you get writers traveling in literary and artistic places, looking for emblems of themselves. Stowe is particularly interesting because throughout the book, she is searching for a painting that will move her. She is searching for a painting that will give her a transcendent sense of the possibility of art. And she finds it. I'm still stunned with how. She finds it in the works of Rubens. And she says in her moment of praise, here is a painter of such power that, quote, he forces you to forgive and accept 1,000 excesses. From now on, I will describe Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as Rubenesque in quality. It's that kind of quality. The travel book's ability to embed a veiled autobiography and some degree of literary manifesto in its accounts of literary pilgrimages merits more attention than it's received. While Americans traveled to Europe to immerse themselves in the artifacts of culture, history, and literature, Europeans in the early and mid-19th century did not usually come to America for its history or its culture or its literature. De Tocqueville came to explore its new political institutions, but more precisely, he came to study the prison system, which apparently worked back then. The United States had the lowest rate of recidivism of any known nation in that. And to escape some political trouble back home, because going abroad is partly running away from things. Frances Trollope, Antony's mother, came to America to join a utopian commune and then to fail at business. She got her revenge by writing Domestic Manners of the Americans in 1832, probably the single most hated book in American eyes ever produced by a British travel writer, even more so than the others. Europeans did come to America to see the natural wonders of a landscape remarkably different from anything Europe offered, with spectacular sights like Niagara Falls and the mighty Mississippi and the Grand Canyon. The United States could certainly claim to possess some stunning scenery. For much of the 19th century, these scenes lacked the kinds of historical and literary connections that the theory of association required, but they were spectacular enough. And Peter Conrad, in his brilliant book, Imagining America, has a chapter in which he takes a dozen writers over the 19th century and shows how they responded to Niagara Falls by making it their own place through that specific vision. For my purposes now, I want to distinguish between natural spaces and those marked by culture and history. Confronting the primeval American wilderness is certainly a different experience than the rolled lawns of the English garden, or the formal and rigid plantings of the French garden, or the series of rooms that constitute a well-designed Italian garden. We read landscapes differently. The wilderness in America may be the devil's territory, as it was for Hawthorne in many of his works, and for some Puritans, or it may be a realm of endless possibility, which it occasionally is in Hawthorne as well, and more so for other writers. Works like Thoreau's The Maine Woods and Twain's Life on the Mississippi provide some models for the variety of approaches. For Thoreau, the dark woods offered the possibility of, quote, traveling of the old heroic kind over the unaltered face of nature. It is the confrontation with an unspoiled wilderness that leads the thoughtful traveler into meaningful moments of contemplation and self-reflection, into a larger understanding of our place in a vast and mysterious universe. For Mark Twain, writing about the Mississippi and his life on it requires a different kind of confrontation with nature and the meaning of time. In the famous scenes in which he describes learning to read the river as a cub pilot, he speaks eloquently of how the book of nature now is read in a different tone and with different meanings. The play of light and shadow on the river that he once would have found beautiful now becomes a sign of danger. It's a warning that there's a snag that can rip the bottom out of his steamboat. Learning to read the river and nature is now a lesson in realism, in a growing and acute awareness of the dangers that lie hidden behind the lovely surfaces of life. The river is, of course, also the archetypal symbol of time, and Twain's autobiographical reflections in this travel book are a confrontation with time and change, and above all else, with loss. The loss of innocence is a continual theme in Life on the Mississippi, both reflecting the cub pilot's transformation into adult reader of the world's dangers and treacheries, and the larger shifts in time following the Civil War that destroyed his profession of steamboating. In moving onward, I want to make what I will admit to be some rather grand conclusions about travel writing and nature itself. Writing about sites associated with art, culture, history, literature may lead to moments of self-reflection, even veiled autobiographies that express aesthetic and moral values. But the confrontation with nature as wilderness almost always involves a deeper confrontation with the self and primeval time and a world that is mysterious, uncertain, and dangerous. The traveler who visits the rich cultural sites of Europe is usually visiting the past. The traveler who visits a primeval wilderness is either visiting the future, when it will be developed, in other words, the endless possibilities that unspoiled nature offers for future development, or visiting a realm outside of time and space, a place outside of conventional notions of time and space. The possibility to discover oneself in nature is a theme that can be found in many places in American literature, in addition to Thoreau's writing. But nature's scary, particularly in America, particularly in the wilderness. And the great American horror films involve cabins in the woods and monsters running around these camps and places, because American wilderness and nature is above all else in our literary culture a place where one can become lost. And this is a central theme, as I've argued elsewhere, in the American Gothic, in Irving, Poe, Hawthorne, and other. And let me note that the British Gothic, as represented by the superb novels of Anne Radcliffe, is completely different. In those works, the heroine is always fleeing the symbols of civilization, usually an imprisoning castle, a decadent aristocrat, corrupt clergyman, the symbols of social and political power in Europe, in order to find salvation in the beneficent arms of nature. The American Gothic is the opposite, and most vividly in Charles Brockden Brown's Edgar Huntley, but in other texts as well. The male protagonist is fleeing from nature itself, from frightening wilderness, savage Indians, fierce predatory animals, to find safety in the town, the fort, the symbol of home and civilization. While there is an implicit critique of social and political power in the structures underlying the British Gothic, probably clearest and most obvious in the works of William Godwin, the American Gothic relies on a wilderness populated by savage people and animals. Once you replace the sources of terror with animals and Native Americans, once you replace social sources with natural one, the source of terror is ultimately not only symbolic but psychological, a projection of the self. and as Leslie Fiedler and others have asserted, the nightmare landscapes of our Gothic reflect constant confrontations with aspects of the self embedded in images of a psychological wilderness. As I move towards my closing observations, I want to say something about American writing that I honestly don't know whether it's true of other literatures and other cultures concerning the treatment of time and space. In American literature, time and space are not separate elements. They are defined by their relationship to each other in particular ways. When Americans write about space and place, they are almost always really writing about time. This may be clearest in the literature of American regionalisms, the works we used to call local color, which capture the particular qualities of specific places in order to recapture a lost moment of time. When Americans write about time, they are almost always really writing about space and place. Thus, if you read the novels of Henry James or Mark Twain or Willa Cather or many others, the movement of time is conveyed almost entirely by spatial movement, by moving the protagonist from place to place. And this may simply because it's hard to write about time and growth, and it's much easier to write about time. I'm going to reduce the ending parts. When Americans traveled to see the ruins of Rome, they were traveling in space in order to see the past. For some Europeans at various moments, most notably the early 20th century, but earlier, traveling to the United States meant going to see the future, or a future world marked by capitalist industrialism and technological innovation. For John Reed, traveling to Russia meant going to see the future and discovering that it works. For some travelers, going to a jungle or the Galapagos, as Melville does in the Encantadas, is going out of time into a kind of primeval space or a world outside of conventional notions of time and space. And I would offer to you, as a perfect illustration of these moments, Bryant's best poem, The Prairies, in which Bryant, as a traveler, 1832, goes to see the gardens of the desert, the prairies for which the speech of England has no name, and he goes through a metaphorical process of envisioning. First, he re-inhabits this world with the mound builders, the Indians who were there and are now gone and left. And then he points out it's natural for people to leave. He then moves on in good American fashion in the 1830s, engages in the act of imaginative genocide that sadly marks American writing. And he explains how the red man has moved to the Rockies, and the beaver has moved, and these other people have now moved away, and it's natural that they would. And then he stays there further, as he talks about the sense of movement and motion, and he hears bees humming. Bees are part of America. Europeans brought the European honeybee to America. It helps pollinate things. Farmers claimed that it made America more fertile. They claimed that the gardens of the Midwest, which used to be called the Great American Desert, was made fertile by two things, bees and the plow. And they argue that if you plow a desert, you get rain. I suspect that may not be fully correct, but Brian engages in the significant act of listening to the bees. And if you know your classics, you understand bees. Bees go out into nature. They work. They're not lazy like spiders that take the poison within themselves and spew out romantic poetry to ensnare people. Bees go out in the fields of nature and in a relationship of work. They pollinate the world, make it more fertile, and they gather pollen and honey, and they come back to their hives and they make honey and beeswax, from which you can have candles. In other words, bees create what Matthew Arnold later calls sweetness and light. It's this envisioning of nature in this meaning and this envisioning of the bees and the multitudes, which he translates into English. From the ground comes up the laugh of children, the soft voice of maidens, and the sweet and solemn hymn of Sabbath worshipers. The low of herds blends with the rustling of the heavy grains over the dark brown furrows, and he's imagined an American future on these open, empty prairies. And that's a good thing for two more lines. All at once, a fresher wind sweeps by and breaks my dream, and I am in the wilderness alone. But it is the wilderness that he has translated for us into a kind of meaning that involves a confrontation with nature, history, native people, and the possibilities and limitations of our life alone, as we are ultimately condemned to break our dream and wake up in the wilderness alone. Thank you.